At 1:30 in the morning on August 21st, 1942, a Marine gunner on Guadalcanal had every reason to pull the trigger. He could hear boots in shallow water. He could see helmets moving across a pale strip of sand. He could see Japanese soldiers closing the distance so fast that the dark between them felt like it was shrinking. 25 yards, 20, 15. And still the order was wait. Not because the Marines were uncertain, because the first weapon in that fight was not the machine gun in front of him. It was a range card, a sheet of paper marked in daylight, with lines, numbers, angles, and one strip of beach where every yard had already been assigned a death. The gunner's hands were on steel, but the battle had already been drawn in pencil. The Japanese soldiers moving toward him did not know that. They believed they were crossing a creek mouth. They were actually stepping onto a measured surface. They believed darkness belonged to them. But on that night, the darkness belonged to men who had spent the afternoon measuring it. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand what the Pacific War felt like before Guadalcanal. In the months after Pearl Harbor, Japan had not simply advanced. It had made speed feel like destiny. Wake Island fell. Guam fell. The Philippines were collapsing. Singapore, the fortress Britain said could not be broken, surrendered. Across thousands of miles of ocean, Japanese forces moved with a confidence that came from proof. Their commanders believed that shock, speed, and night assault could crack enemy positions before defenders found their shape. They had seen it work in China. They had seen it work in Malaya. They had seen troops break under shouting, bayonets, darkness, and sudden violence. So when Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's first echelon reached Guadalcanal, the logic seemed simple. A small American force had landed on the island. The airfield near Lunga Point had to be retaken. The Americans were new to jungle war. The Japanese had trained for this kind of attack for years. In Japanese planning, the night itself was a weapon. But Guadalcanal did not give Ichiki the battlefield he thought he was entering. It gave him a narrow mouth of water, a sandbar, and a marine perimeter built around Henderson Field. The unfinished airstrip that both sides understood was the key to the island. Lose the strip, and the Marines could be strangled. Hold it, and aircraft from that raw coral runway could threaten Japanese ships moving down the slot. So the Marines did something that looked almost passive from the outside. They dug in. They studied the ground. They placed weapons where the terrain forced movement. They turned the eastern approach to the Lunga perimeter into a problem of angles. The creek the Marines called Alligator Creek, also known as the Ilu River, ran near the coastline and created a brutal tactical fact. A force attacking from the east along the beach could not appear everywhere at once. It had to concentrate, it had to cross, and where it crossed, Marines could build a box, not a metaphorical box, a real one. Machine guns on the west bank, barbed wire in front, artillery concentrations plotted beyond, and 37mm anti-tank guns aimed not at tanks, because there were no Japanese tanks coming across that sand, but at men. The ammunition made the difference. Canister rounds turned the small anti-tank guns into enormous shotguns. Instead of firing one solid projectile, the guns spat a storm of steel balls forward in a spreading cone. At close range, that cone did not behave like a single shot. It behaved like a wall. And that wall could cover the exact width of the place the attackers had to pass through. That was the part the Marines needed every gunner to understand. If they opened too early, the Japanese would scatter into cover. If they opened too late, men would be inside the line. The trap depended on discipline so unnatural, it almost felt like disobedience to the body. Everything in a human being says fire when danger gets close. The Marines had to do the opposite. They had to let the danger finish walking into the geometry. The warning that made the geometry useful came from a scout named Jacob Vouza. Vouza knew the Guadalcanal trails better than most Marines knew the layout of their own barracks. Japanese troops captured him, found evidence of his work with the Allies, and tortured him. They left him for dead. He was not dead. Badly wounded, he escaped and made his way back to American lines with the message the perimeter needed. Japanese troops were coming along the coast. The target was the line near the creek. That meant the range cards were not just careful, they were alive. They pointed at the place the enemy was actually going to appear. So the Marines waited. Just after midnight, listening posts heard the first sounds, voices, equipment, metal touching metal, the low disturbance of men moving through darkness in formation. Then the Japanese attack began. A flare went up. Machine guns and mortars from the east bank opened toward the Marine line, and the first assault wave charged across the Sandbar. This is the moment where the story is often told as courage against courage. But that is not what made it decisive. Both sides had courage. The Japanese soldiers kept coming into fire that should have made movement impossible. The Marines held their fire while armed men closed to distances that made every second feel like a personal test. Courage was everywhere. The difference was preparation. At the chosen distance, the 37-millimeter guns fired. One blast did not sound like rifle fire. It sounded like a door being slammed shut on the entire beach. Steel spread across the front of the assault wave. Then the water-cooled Brownings opened. Their barrels did not hunt randomly in the dark. They moved through assigned lanes. Each crew had memorized reference points before nightfall, a patch of sand, a tree shape, a break in the bank, a line where the gun should stop before another gun's lane began. It was not panic fire. It was a machine built from men, guns, paper, and terrain. The first Japanese charge was destroyed, not delayed, not discouraged, destroyed. But Ichiki did not withdraw. He ordered another attack. More men went forward into the same measured ground. Some reached the wire. A few cut through. Some made it close enough for the fight to collapse into grenades, rifle butts, and bodies moving in the dark. That mattered because no defensive plan is perfect if it assumes nothing gets through. The Marine plan had a second layer. Reserve troops were held close enough to seal penetrations before one small success became a break in the line. When Japanese soldiers crossed into the western bank positions, Marines counterattacked inside the perimeter and killed or drove them out. The range card had not replaced infantry. It had given infantry time to survive. By morning, the beach looked less like a battlefield than the aftermath of a failed experiment. The Japanese had tested a belief that a determined night assault could break Americans before Americans could organize. The belief had walked into canister fire, machine gun lanes, and artillery planned before the first shot. It did not survive. The following daylight brought the final horror. Marine tanks and infantry moved against the remaining Japanese survivors east of the creek. The first echelon of Ichiki's force had been nearly wiped out. Roughly 800 of about 900 men were dead. Ichiki himself did not leave the battlefield alive. The number shocked both armies, but the meaning mattered more than the number. The Japanese had not lost because their soldiers lacked bravery. They lost because their doctrine assumed darkness would create confusion. The Marines had removed the confusion before the attack began. That was the real discovery at Alligator Creek. Not that Americans could fight at night. Not that machine guns were deadly. Everyone already knew that. The discovery was colder. A defensive position could be engineered so thoroughly that the attacker's courage became irrelevant to the outcome. The terrain could be made to answer before the attacker even asked the question. But one night did not prove a doctrine. One night could be dismissed as luck, arrogance, bad reconnaissance, or one commander walking his men into the wrong place. The next test came less than a month later, on a ridge south of Henderson Field. This time, the battlefield was not a neat strip of sand. It was broken jungle, slopes, ravines, and elephant grass. It was harder to see, harder to measure, harder to command, and the Japanese force was larger. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi brought thousands of troops toward the Lunga perimeter to retake the airfield. If Alligator Creek was a box, Edson's Ridge was a crooked blade of ground pointing toward Henderson Field. Hold the ridge, and the airfield lived. Lose it, and Japanese troops could drive into the heart of the Marine position. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's Raiders and Parachute Marines held that ground. They were exhausted. They had already been fighting, patrolling, and sleeping badly in the rot and heat of Guadalcanal, and now they were asked to do the same difficult thing the Marines at the creek had done. Make the terrain do part of the killing. Pre-register artillery. Establish fallback positions. Prepare fields of fire. Know the ground before the enemy enters it. But Edson's Ridge almost broke the theory. That is the part that gets lost when the story is flattened into doctrine. The Japanese did not politely feed themselves into one corridor. They attacked through jungle in multiple waves. They pushed against the Marine line with enough force that positions bent, shrank, and sometimes disappeared. Men became separated in the dark. Units lost contact. The line pulled back toward the final ridge. At moments, the defense looked less like geometry and more like a crowd of exhausted Marines trying not to be overrun. Then the prepared fires began to show their value. Artillery did not wait for perfect visibility. It fell on concentrations and approaches already plotted, not because an observer could see every soldier in the jungle, because the likely routes had been studied, because the dead ground had been marked, because a commander had asked before the battle where a force would naturally gather, climb, pause, and push. The answer was already on the map. Again, courage ran into preparation. Japanese troops reached dangerous points. They fought with ferocity. They nearly broke through. But each time the fight seemed to loosen, another layer of the prepared defense tightened. Artillery on approach routes. Small arms across the crest. Reserves shifted to the threatened point. Commanders moving men by what the terrain required, not by what a manual looked like in a classroom. Edson's Ridge was not the clean killing field of Alligator Creek. It was dirtier, closer, more frightening, and precisely because of that, it proved something more important. The idea did not only work on a perfect sandbar. It could work when the ground was ugly, the line was tired, and the enemy adapted. By the end of the battle, Kawaguchi's assault had failed. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers lay dead in the jungle approaches. The Marines had survived the most dangerous land threat to Henderson Field so far, and the lesson became harder to dismiss. Then came October, the largest Japanese ground effort yet pushed toward Henderson Field under Lieutenant General Harakichichi Yakutake. This was no longer a small force testing American nerve. This was a major attempt to crush the perimeter. Japanese troops came through jungle, across river lines, and against prepared positions in a coordinated effort to retake the airfield. The defenders had more men by then, including army troops, but they were still sitting on an island under pressure from sea, air, jungle, weather, and hunger. Japanese naval bombardments battered Henderson Field. Aircraft were destroyed. Fuel and supplies burned. The Marines and soldiers inside the perimeter understood that the enemy was not simply going to repeat Ichiki's mistake forever. The Japanese had watched. They had learned. They knew frontal rushes into obvious lanes could be murderous. So the October offensive tried to widen the problem. More axes, more pressure, more places for defenders to worry about at once. This was the counter to any prepared fire plan. Force the defender to divide attention until no point is strong enough. For a while, that logic had teeth. Japanese units moved through terrain so thick that sound arrived before sight. Some attacks came close enough that artillery became dangerous to use. In jungle, distance vanishes. When distance vanishes, mathematics loses some of its clean authority. A plotted concentration cannot help if friend and enemy are almost on top of each other. So the defenders had to combine two kinds of truth: the paper truth of pre-planned fires, and the human truth of small units holding in darkness. Machine gun crews fired into lanes already assigned. Artillery struck crossing sites, assembly areas, and routes that geography made likely. Riflemen and grenadiers fought the parts of the battle no chart could solve. Reserves moved where the line sagged. Command posts shifted messages through wire, runner, and radio. Every prepared calculation still needed men willing to stand under the result. By October 26th, Hyakutake's offensive had failed. Japanese losses were catastrophic. The last serious ground attempt to retake Henderson Field had been broken. Guadalcanal would continue to bleed at sea and in the air, but on land the pattern had changed. The Japanese could still fight. They could still kill. They could still make every yard expensive, but the early war assumption that American positions would collapse under night assault had been damaged beyond repair. The Marines had learned something that every island defense after Guadalcanal would carry forward. Do not wait for the enemy to teach you the shape of the battle. Study the ground first. Mark the likely approaches. Plan the fires. Build overlapping lanes. Hold a reserve. Make the attacker solve a problem while already inside the answer. That sounds simple after it works. Before it works, it feels like heresy. American military culture did not naturally worship defense, especially not in the Marine Corps. The Marine identity was built around movement, aggression, landing, closing with the enemy, taking the objective. Digging in and letting the enemy come close could feel like surrendering initiative. But Guadalcanal exposed a truth that does not care about identity. Sometimes the most aggressive thing a commander can do is refuse to move. Sometimes the attack is defeated before it begins, not by a charge, but by a quiet decision about where to place a gun. And sometimes the hardest order in battle is not advance. It is wait. The range card is easy to overlook because it is not heroic looking. It does not roar. It does not charge. It does not appear on monuments. It is a piece of paper telling frightened men where to aim when fear tells them to do anything else. But that little document carried the real revolution. A range card says the ground has been read. It says the gun crew knows its left limit and right limit. It says another gun has the next lane. It says the field in front of the position is not empty darkness. It is measured space. That is what Ichiki's men entered at the creek. Measured space. That is what Kawaguchi's troops hit on the ridge. Measured space. That is what Hyakutake's offensive kept encountering around Henderson Field. Not a wall in the traditional sense. A system. And systems are terrifying in war because bravery does not automatically break them. Bravery can break a weak man. Bravery can break a thin line. Bravery can break a commander who doubts himself. But bravery does not bargain with intersecting fields of fire. It does not negotiate with canister at 30 yards. It does not persuade artillery shells to fall somewhere else once the coordinates are set. That is the brutal side of the lesson. The dangerous side came later, because once a principle works, everyone who survives starts learning it. The Japanese learned it too. At Tarawa in November 1943, Marines assaulting BDO faced a Japanese defense that had absorbed the same truth from the other side. Pre-sighted weapons, interlocking fields of fire, barriers that forced movement into planned zones, a reef and beach that turned approach into exposure. American Marines now found themselves moving through the kind of prepared killing space that Japanese attackers had faced at Alligator Creek. The geometry did not care whose flag was behind it. It only cared who had prepared the ground. That is why Guadalcanal's lesson is not comforting. It is not a clean story about one side discovering a trick and winning forever. It is a story about war becoming more exact, more studied, more technical, more punishing to anyone forced to move through ground another army has already solved. The range card saved lives on defense. It also revealed how deadly a properly prepared defense could be to any attacker, including Marines. So what is the real legacy of that night at the creek? It is not that machines beat men. The Marines were not machines. They were scared, tired, sweating men trying to hold their fire while enemy soldiers ran toward them. It is not that courage stopped mattering. Courage mattered everywhere. It mattered for the Marines who waited. It mattered for Vouza, dragging his wounded body back with a warning. It mattered for Japanese soldiers who kept moving into fire no human being should have been able to face. The legacy is harsher and more useful. Courage without preparation can be spent like ammunition. Preparation makes courage last longer. It gives fear a job. It gives darkness a shape. It gives exhausted men something more reliable than instinct, when instinct is screaming the wrong order. At Alligator Creek, the Marines did not defeat the Japanese night assault by being louder. They defeated it by being ready before the sound began. They turned a creek mouth into a diagram. They turned a sandbar into a range. They turned a sheet of paper into the first shot of the battle. And when the enemy came close enough for every nerve to beg for fire, the men behind the guns trusted the line they had drawn in daylight. That was the weapon, not the paper, not the gun. The discipline to believe the paper long enough for the gun to matter. History usually remembers the blast. But the battle was won in the waiting.